about the palace of Soviet culture in the discourse of the urban population on the example of the Abovyan palace of culture. Thank you for organizing such an interesting conference. For the 4th day running, we're enjoying one over the other interesting presentation, enriching ourselves. This will be the last, and I'll try to fit within the time allocation. This is not about folklore, but I will use the feedback and memoirs of my respondents to illustrate how the Palace of Culture formed the urban environment. These are mostly the literature I have perused. They identify the culture palace and house of culture. When you look for definitions, sometimes there is house of culture, in parentheses, palace of culture. I try to propose that for the thesis that they're, after all, different structures, quite distinct, on 3 levels. The first is the chronology, because in various Soviet periods they were created spatial. The club, the house of culture, and their prototypes in Soviet institutional landscape were predated by the Reader's Hut, Red Corner, tea houses, party clubs, short-lived. On the basis thereof, the culture house came about, mostly taking up rural spaces in villages, and it's the Sovietization, the main vehicle for Sovietization of local culture, whereas my communication is called upon to demonstrate that the palace of culture, if we use the theory of walls, this is culture too, comes about later and mostly is characterized by post-industrial, in the formation of new industrial cities as well as major urban conglomerates. It's not incidental that in Soviet Armenia, houses of culture, after the decision of 1933, all reader huts, red corners, the main issue of illiteracy and analphabetism was resolved. They were all renamed clubs and assumed new functions. Mostly the proliferation of houses of cultures is linked with the end of the World War II, whereas the policies of culture came about in the late Soviet period. In some studies that I looked at, they were of Soviet period by Soviet scholars like Vazanjan, Folyan, Alikhanyan. Before 1960s, all of their publications, we encounter the house of culture term. The palace of culture or culture palace emerges in the late or even post-Soviet academic discourse. This clearly illustrates that they are chronologically apart, these two structures. The next important difference is functional. The urban palace of culture becomes a multifunctional structure compared to the house of culture. I tried to somehow illustrate how the industrial new cities built their palaces of culture. I want to thank Arutun Marutyan, who shared some designs by Tiran Marutyan. This is Charen Savan culture palaces by Tiran Marutyan, and we already see that the House of Culture architecture is quite different from the Palace of Culture. I'm not an architect. The House of Culture is club-like. It was based on the Reader's Hut, Red Corner, whereas the Palace of Culture looks like this Stalinist, like Mr. Abrasamyan mentioned. It has capitals, it has columns, usually with a fountain or a pool. It's more similar to Stalinist architecture. The Hrazdan Palace of Culture 1950 design, we already see there. And this is in Ashtarak, the Palace of Culture, Hakopan Yaralav Israelian architects. Kajaran Palace of Culture, you already see bas-reliefs and sculptures. I've looked at several designs and browsed the archives. Looking at photographs, there are certain designs that were never built, but these also clearly bring forward the Stalinist style pools, sculptures. This is Yerevan Palace of Culture of the aluminum plant in Kaunas. In its scale, this is perhaps one of the biggest. Let's move on to case review. As a new industrial town's urban culture formation epitome, let's look at Abovyan. This is the initial the rural settlement that turned into Abovyan was initially called Elar. Elar Culture House, designed by Tiran Marutyan, was designed as a house of culture. In 63, Elar was granted the status of a city, was called Abovyan. The population started to grow exponentially. I'll skip several slides. In 1960, in Abovyan, there were 2,200 inhabitants. In 1970, it was already 14,700. In the 60s, there was a spike in the population growth because they started commissioned industrial plants, and naturally this required the influx of workforce from various villages. The repatriates were settled in Abovyan. One of my respondents, interlocutors, makes this claim. When in 1967 plant number 18 opened up, the director, Anton Alexandrovich, went to Kiryvabad, corralled all Armenians in the radiotechnics plant there, brought them, gave them apartments here, and they started working here. Even showed which districts they were settled in. We see that in the beginning of the formation of Abovyan, there was this multi-ethnic, multicultural stratum. On the one hand, it was repatriates, mostly from Syria and Iran. And my respondents also mentioned that after the collapse of the Soviet Union in the 90s, most of them left the city and the country. Former rural inhabitants, ethnic and religious minorities. They mentioned they were Yazidis, Kurds, Molokhans, Russians, Ukrainians, who were seconded to kickstart the production in those plants. There were professional engineers that came with their families. Abovyan, as a new industrial city, had to create urban culture, bringing together all these various cultural strata intertwined and interacting. Who is the cultural mutual influences that I acknowledged in collecting my material? A long-time employee, Karine of the Culture Palace, said that the repatriates brought along with them. We borrowed from them the coffee culture, coffee, tabbouleh culture. We borrowed, and in the Palace of Culture, we organized national cuisine evenings and events. And for example, the repatriates brought with them coffee, kuku, lahmacun, tabbouleh. We learned it from them. We were using coffee, but not on a massive scale, and they introduced it into. They served coffee with cucumbers and carrots. That was something strange for us. Whenever we entered their houses, they asked, would you like a cup of coffee? So in the Culture Palace, during the breaks, we started drinking coffee, and it became massive scale. But we did not borrow the carrots and cucumbers, neither the painting the parquet red, because it was good quality Soviet parquet. Why paint it red? We see the cultural interactions at play here, and it's interesting also that the repatriates, what else did they bring? Most of the repatriates were good artisans, cobblers, jewelers, and they set up macrame, embroidery, interest clubs in the Culture Palace. This was the place where all of these various cultural layers interacted, crossed paths, and contributed to the formation of new urban culture. It's interesting that the city's Culture Palace was overseeing the cultural turnover. When the first restaurants opened in Abovyan in 1970s, and middle of 80s, called Artsivan Kotaik. It was a cultural palace that was entrusted with overseeing the musical culture in the restaurants. Madame Karine said that we controlled for there to not to be any ravis or gurgling performances there. We coordinated with the City Hall's culture department employee. We vetted their programmings not to allow for wrong music to sound. So the Palace of Culture becomes not only a center of dissemination, but also of controlling administratively the culture in the city up to 1970s. It's remarkable that when the population of Abovyan just began to boom, prior to that there were two houses of culture in the ground floors of apartment blocks. They were called Culture House 1, Culture House 2. One was the city culture house, the other was the provincial culture house. But when the population grew in numbers, there was a need for some more serious structure, and through the creation of the Palace of Culture, it started. It's remarkable that through the creation of the Culture Palace, these two houses of culture did not phase out, but they just were attached to the Culture Palace. The Culture Palace started to provide methodological guidance for the latter two. Madame Karine says that she was the instructor, methodology instructor there, and she is employed to this day in that capacity. I will quickly pass through the subsequent fate of the Culture Palace. We dictated, we said what's right, what's wrong, what lectures had to be delivered, and how, what culture had to emanate from the palace and get disseminated. This is the current shape of the Culture Palace. In the 90s, it became dilapidated and ceased to operate because all of the song and dance interest clubs, without having any funding, tried to splinter off, gain independence, and they became standalone structures, organizations, which still failed to deliver, and they sort of did not enjoy long lives and phased out themselves. The Culture Palace reopened in 2005. This is the main hall. This is the methodology instructor's plaque, which is still adorning the door of Karine Hartunian. They changed the medium, but the name and the payroll position remained the same. This is the 2005, the Culture Palace transformed into Gagik Zarogan Abovyan Sports and Culture Complex Center. So did Mr. Zarogan personally finance and privatize it? Is the question that all employees unanimously claim no, it's financed by the state. They just entered Zarogan's name on the plaque. When I was asking the same to common inhabitants, they said, of course, maybe they did not privatize it formally, not to raise any concerns, but in reality, it was Zarogan who financed it and did everything. The culture of palace, palace culture remained unrepaired and dilapidated, but on the same land plot he built a great gym, a pool, and a hotel where he entertains various delegations and teams from various countries. The Culture Palace turned into athletic development center, one may say. The culture segment is inoperational. In any case, there's one person employed, Karine, who's been there since 1982, and she claims that we don't do much. We just a rudiment. I come here, spend the day. But you know what we were doing in the past? We were promoting the whole and controlling the whole culture of the city, the turnover. We organized cultural events, whereas there's nothing left, and we lack the vibrance of the past. And what I was impressed with, in the Soviet period, there was censorship, and we were dictating, imposing censorship. There is nothing to control now, she lamented. There are also interesting memoirs that are interesting to browse through. The purpose of my communication was to demonstrate how the palace of culture through its architecture, functional, chronological specifics, different from the house of culture, and how these new structures become not only the instrument for Sovietization or oversight over national culture, but also contribute to the formation of urban culture. Because if in the villages the houses of culture were dealing with the local dimension of culture and were called upon to Sovietize it, quote unquote, whereas here in the cities, especially in the industrial cities, we're dealing with various cultural layers and strata where the Palace of Culture becomes one of the structures to create, form, and disseminate this culture. Thank you for your attention.